And welcome to the League of Women Voters Minneapolis 2018-2019 Civic Buzz Series. My name is Jelaine Height, and I'll be leading this evening's meeting. Tonight begins a new year of issues discussion here at the Black Forest. These meetings are free and open to the public, but organized and run by the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. Our members are deeply involved in deciding these issues for study. We look for issues that affect our lives and can be affected by our actions and those of our government. We're so glad you're here tonight. It means you are also willing to learn more and discuss and take action. Thanks to the Whittier Alliance for sponsoring the Civic Buzz by advertising these programs through their network. And thank you to Bill from the Uptake here. He'll be videotaping tonight and get this video up on the Uptake, and we'll get it on our website so the discussion can continue. Our format changes a bit this evening as we have two speakers instead of one, and which will be followed by questions from the audience. We find that your questions always bring out more information, but directed to your interest. With that in mind, the speakers will finish by about 6:45 to ensure you time for your questions. We will officially end at 7:30. But I encourage you to stay and continue discussion after that if you wish. Our topic tonight has been in the news. If you read the Star Tribune, you'll know they ran a several-part series on sexual assault and policing. The series was very enlightening, but we felt we needed more perspectives and some discussion. I connected with Jennifer Boerhaus, one of the writers of the series, and she recommended we ask Kristen Houston Shaw from the Minneapolis Sexual Violence Center, or Terry McLaughlin and Jude Foster from the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Happily, we have two of the three here tonight. With this series running in the Strip, both of these centers were inundated with calls, so the fact that we have anyone here tonight to speak to us shows just how important this issue is to them. So our speakers tonight are Kristen Houston Shaw, Executive Director of the Sexual Violence Center. The Sexual Violence Center provides a 24-hour crisis line, one-to-one counseling, support groups, and more. Jude Foster is here from the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. This organization connects members and allies to tools and training for rapid and effective response to sexual violence and victims in their communities. Terry McLaughlin, Executive Director of the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, was also planning to be here tonight. However, she's home tonight recovering from virus. In the interest of moving the program along, I will let Kristen and Jude tell you more about themselves and the work they are doing. I have let them know that we are interested in learning their perspective on sexual assault, especially in working with the police, and then insights they may have on how we could take any action that may help improve results. So, Kristen and Jude, you're on.
Everybody, can everyone hear me okay? So, Terry was sick tonight and not able to be with us, and so I'm standing here with Jude Foster, and I think she needs a little bit of an introduction, so I'm going to give it to you. Because Jude used to work at my agency, the Sexual Violence Center, for 15 years. She actually helped build our agency. She trained me. I was actually one of Jude's volunteers back in the day. She actually designed our advocacy model. I want to tell you a little bit about that so you understand just how important her contribution was to Minneapolis in general, and Hennepin Carver and Scott. Woo!
Get further away. There we go.
Okay. All right, so part of the work that we do, because before we talk about the issue, I'd like to talk about our agency a little bit. So I want to expand on the and other that you talked about with regards to our services. So SVC is a rape crisis center, a dedicated sexual violence center. We specialize on this issue of sexual violence that now we're very excited. We read about in the newspaper locally in the last couple of weeks, and of course nationally. It's been in the newspaper. I think all of us have seen stories almost every day now since last October and November when the Me Too movement went viral again last fall until now. But these are topics that really, sexual violence thrives in silence. And so our heads are still spinning a little bit. We're still not used to people talking about our issues so much and inviting us places to talk about it, so I can't say how thrilled we are to be here. So we offer a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week crisis line for anyone from any walk of life who's had sexual violence come into it. So it could be me, it was like my body it happened to, but also maybe my friends or my family or my parent is also really struggling with how to support me. And they can call us as well. We have individual counseling and groups. We offer a 24/7 response to 11 hospitals across 3 counties. So if someone is sexually assaulted and they go to the emergency room and they tell the triage nurse, I was raped, we get called. And we actually start the counseling right there in the hospital. And then we have what we call legal advocacy. We're not lawyers, but we have a lot of friends who are lawyers that we can refer people to, and we can help people do an initial police report, walk through investigation if their case is going to go forward, and we'll talk more about how most of them don't, which is I think why we're here today. And then applying for restraining orders and so forth. So our services are free for anyone as long as they're 12 years of age or above. And they are victim-centered and they're empowerment-based. So we believe when someone is sexually assaulted or has sexual violence come into their life, someone's taken their power away from them. Our most basic fundamental right, which is to be able to decide what happens to our bodies, right, has been taken away from someone. So we see their healing as very much, let's get their power back to them, right? Every step forward after sexual violence comes into someone's life should be on that survivor's terms. What would they like to see going forward? What would they find healing? Now, the majority of the people who come to the Sexual Violence Center are not actually going to make a police report. So even though the cases that we're talking about that are in the Star Tribune involve maybe someone having made that report and law enforcement letting them down, I want you to know that for most people who we work with, they're not even making that report. And you might have questions about why, we can talk about later. There's many reasons why, but we have a room in our office specifically designed for law enforcement to come in and do that initial report. And about 8 out of 10 people we work with are never going to take advantage of it. Before I go further in the topic, I want to point out my colleague and partner in crime, Kathy T, in the back, if you wave your hand. You all chose to come here tonight. There's something about this topic that's compelling to you, and it may be personal experience with sexual violence in your background. Often when we're talking about these things, like emotions might come up or memories that you really don't want to even think about right now. If you want someone to talk to, Kathy's a trained advocate, a confidential counselor, and she'd be really happy to talk to you. So if you want to get up and go in the back and chat with her, she'd be really glad to talk to you. Anyway, so that was a detour away from talking about Jude. But anyway, I'm just excited because I've never been able to actually present with her before, so I'm really excited and I want her to be able to say something.
Okay. I was just telling Kristen when I came in here, full disclosure, I'm a little crabby today. I just drove up from Red Wing and traffic was terrible. Did anybody have to drive on 94 or anything like that today? Oh, God, that was a mess. But that was really nice. Thanks for saying that. So my name is Jude Foster. I work for the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. The Sexual Violence Justice Institute is housed in the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or MinCASA. We're a national TA provider. We do work with multidisciplinary teams. Yes.
You have to talk louder.
Do I?
Yeah.
How many times have you heard that?
Normally
Normally people are like, Jude, tone it down, be quiet.
No one says that to me.
So we provide technical assistance and support to multidisciplinary teams. So there are many communities in the state of Minnesota and across the country that have law enforcement, prosecution, victim advocacy, corrections, and advocacy coming together. And some of these teams work on initial response to sexual assault. The teams that we work with are writing protocols and trying to improve their response. I just celebrated my 25th year anniversary of being a sexual assault advocate, which I'm pretty proud of, because there aren't many of us that lasted that long. Thank you. So I am currently, should I move even further away? Okay. I'm currently the statewide medical forensic policy program coordinator. So I'm a hybrid, so I work with both MNCASA and the SVJI side. And basically I work with all things kits. So you've probably heard about a kit backlog. We don't have a kit backlog. Don't get me started on that. We have an accumulation of unsubmitted kits. And I'm really happy to be here because 18 of those 25 years I spent doing direct services, mostly at the Sexual Violence Center. I also used to work at PAVSA in Duluth. I'm excited to be here tonight because I cannot tell you how many times I've heard victim survivors of sexual assault say to me, I don't know which was worse, surviving the sexual assault or surviving the criminal justice system. And I'm really excited that there's been a lot of interest from these Star Tribune articles. And I'm really excited, I'm always excited to connect and work with the Sexual Violence Center, which is one of our partner programs. So we represent rape crisis centers and dual, which are domestic violence and sexual assault programs. We have about 70 members. And then, so we do public policy work, we do prevention work, and we do a lot of education. So that's kind of us in a nutshell. I haven't been on the ground doing direct services for about 2 years, so I've been out of the trenches for 2 years, and I haven't been doing direct services in Hennepin County since 2013. So I really wanted Kristen and the Sexual Violence Center to be here tonight because these are the people who respond to sexual violence in your community. So, Kristen, do you want to do the framework?
How many of you have seen Law and Order SVU? Couple folks, okay. Fun side note, I can't tell you how many times we get checks in the mail at the Sexual Violence Center for SVU. I will cash it. Our bank understands. Okay, but even if you haven't seen, have you seen like any Law and Orders? Like enough that you have a sense of what I might be talking about. Okay, mostly I'm seeing head nods. So I think Law and Order has confused people as to what's actually going on with regards to sexual violence in our communities, because it gives us this message. A crime happens, to us, we're the victim of a crime, and then certain things are going to happen. Olivia Benson is going to come, incredibly glamorous. She's going to believe me, and she's going to immediately go after the person who did this to me, and then that person is probably going to go to jail, and there's probably going to be a trial, and then, or there's going to be a trial, and then that person's going to go to prison at the end of it, right? It's kind of how we're trained, whether through civics class or whether through TV, to think about what happens in our society, and it just isn't so. Criminal sexual conduct there's a series of criminal sexual conduct crimes, and in the state of Minnesota, that's what sexual assault normally falls under, right? These are the most underreported crimes in the country, so they're not even making it to Olivia Benson. Let's stop there. But then for people who are actually making that initial police report, there's a winnowing process that happens. So I'm going to just focus on Minneapolis because that's where we're seated. But we work with, just in Hennepin County alone, we work with 34 different police jurisdictions, which is complex. But we'll take Minneapolis because that's what many of the articles were focused on. So there's an initial police report made. There's 5 precincts in the city. So someone could go, technically you're supposed to go to the precinct that covers the geographic area where the crime occurred, make your police report. That initial report is just going to be taken by a patrol officer who got some training in sexual violence reporting in the academy, but may or may not have ever taken a report since then. Often what we hear from victims and survivors is that the officer was more scared than I was. He couldn't say the word penis. Sorry if you weren't knowing that we were going to go there. We're going to go there. It was a rough go of it. And in many respects, because we do work closely with the MPD, we feel for a lot of those officers because it is technical, it is specific to be able to talk with someone in trauma about the worst sexual experience of their life when we live in a culture where we have trouble even talking about sex when it's good, right? So that's tricky enough as it is. But then they get some training, and because these crimes are so underreported, they don't do it enough to get good at it. So maybe you get one, and then it's 6 months or a year later before you get another. You know, it's tough. Every time is like the new, worst, awful time. So they go through this initial report, and as I said, we'll have reports done in our office as well. We're within the 2nd precinct, so the 2nd precinct will just dispatch someone to us, or we can go with people to the precincts. And then these reports go downtown to City Hall, room 108. That's where the sex crimes unit is. There's a lieutenant in charge of sex crimes. And for your information, in the first 4 years I was in this job, I worked with 5. So that's their rate of turnover. That person gets emails every morning with all of the reports. And that person's unenviable job is to read through these reports and figure out which ones are just a bad report, maybe poorly written, and we need to go back to that victim. Which ones maybe is just a crime didn't occur, or it just looks like it's not anything and we can't waste investigator time on it. And which ones are now going to go into this juggling act with the investigators, the very few investigators that they actually have in the sex crimes unit, trying to actually cover them all. There are 5 investigators working in the Minneapolis sex crimes unit right now. To give you some perspective, in the early 90s, I don't remember the exact years, there was a serial rapist in Uptown. There was a big story, like 91, 92, something like that. The response from the MPD was to assign 11 investigators to the sex crimes unit in response to that, right? So now we have less than half. And so this process is called redlining, and so then the person has to, sit and sort of go through these, and that is just an impossible job. And every single person I've worked with who does this, cares very much about, figuring out what's going on with these reports, but there's something systemic there. I think you can see that. That's a challenge. If you have far too few investigators to be able to address the number of reports that you're getting, we know the quality of many of these reports to be poor because the subject matter is so sensitive, and because any patrol officer could take a report, as I mentioned before, it's just rough going, oftenly. Sometimes they're great, but sometimes they're not, and we need to be honest about that. So that process goes forward of the assigning of the cases, the determination of which cases can't be investigated. And then a group of incredibly overworked investigators are trying to figure out what's actually going on. Sexual violence is a really broad umbrella term for us, and it encompasses many different behaviors. And the sex crimes unit takes on many different kinds of cases. And more, a lot of these cases are technology-based, which can even add a further complexity to investigating them. There's like apps like Snapchat, for example, where if something is sent, then it disappears. Well, there's an image of it up in the cloud, but then you have to get a warrant to get it down, and it's complex, it takes time. In Minneapolis, officers are now wearing body cameras, which means that there's footage that has to be reviewed from the body cameras. So even the work of investigating these cases that fall under criminal sexual conduct is more challenging, more laborious, and takes more time than even 10, 15 years ago when there had double the number of investigators. And then the cases are getting investigated, and then a certain percentage of them, and that number is not totally publicly available to us, then are sent over to the Hennepin County Attorney's Office for them to decide whether they're going to charge it. So often you hear people talking about pressing charges. That's TV. I, as an individual, I can't press charges. It's actually the county attorney's office who decides that. My decision-making point in this process is whether I'm going to make that report or not. Then once I've made the report, it's going to go forward, and someone else is going to decide if there's charging decision. And that, in Minneapolis, would be the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. They determine if they think that a crime can be proven before a jury of 12, and whether they think that they could take the case forward to completion. So I have to walk and I'm scared. Can you get that pile for me? I want to hand out this graphic, and I didn't want to put it in the back because I wanted you to, thank you. I wanted you to all see it. I recognize that reading these articles in the Star Tribune is appalling. And I'm here to tell you something even worse, which is that the rate of sort of viability of these cases to move forward to justice that we read about in those articles is utterly consistent with the nationwide average on how these cases are handled. Minneapolis is not an outlier. So I'm handing out a graphic that's from 2014, so a couple of years old, produced by researchers for End Violence Against Women International. We call it the inverse pyramid. So it says these are nationwide stats, right? But of 100 rapes that are committed, so we're talking specifically about rape now, not even other forms of criminal sexual conduct, 5 to 20 ever are going to get reported to police, right? Then of that, even a lesser number are going to be investigated. Of that, even a lesser number are going to be charged. A lesser number are going to be prosecuted. And even a lesser number are going to result in a successful conviction and incarceration of an offender. Now, I should take a step back and tell you that I'm not here to advocate for putting more people in prison. As a general rule, like that's not the philosophy that the Sexual Violence Center upholds. And I think actually the graphic that you're holding would tell you why. Because think about all the people who are falling off that pyramid, right? If there's 100 rapes that are committed, look at the tiny little number of people who are actually incarcerated. That means the majority of people who are perpetrating this behavior are not ever going to jail for it. And part two, if we were to put them all in jail, it actually would be untenable for our society because there's too many people. So I'm not here to suggest that imprisonment is necessarily the best option here on a larger sort of theoretical sense. But yet I'm a victim advocate, it's my job. And when I'm working with an individual victim or survivor, and I use the word interchangeably, of sexual assault, what that person says goes for me. As I mentioned before, we're on an empowerment-based model, right? So they get to decide, going forward, this is going to feel like me taking my power back. So if I have someone who has suffered something that nobody deserves to suffer, sitting with me and saying, what's going to feel like justice to me is if I go through this criminal process and this person goes to jail, then that's what I'm for. So for what I want is for that process to work more for more victim survivors. Because when it doesn't, it places a disproportionate burden on our counseling model to help people move forward. Because like it or not, better or worse, the criminal justice process gives certain messages to people. What it tells victims is, we believe you. This happened to you, and what happened to you was wrong, and you deserve support for it. And when people don't go through that process, whether because they've chosen themselves not to go through it or because someone else has decided their case isn't a winner and it's not going to go forward, they are denied those messages. And I will tell you, that's what people who are at the Sexual Violence Center for Counseling struggle with. They think people don't believe them. They question whether they deserved it. They question whether there was something that they did that brought that on themselves. They live in perpetual fear of the person who did that to them because 85% of victims know their perpetrators. So if their perpetrator continues to live in the community, that might be an ongoing safety risk for them, right? So I think I'm going to keep my remarks to that, but I did want to hand out that graphic so you know that in our discussions, because I've been in many meetings now with the Hennepin County Attorney's Office and different police jurisdictions in the lead up to the articles coming out and afterwards. And my message to them has been like, okay, it's true. I mean, it's true that this is actually consistent with the nationwide response to sexual assault. Let's make Minneapolis great, right? Like, why can't we be the exceptional one? Why can't we show transformational leadership in this issue? Why can't we be the ones to crack this and do something differently? It's just not okay to say, well, we're no worse than anyone else, right? Like, we want to be better, and that's the kind of discussions that we've been having. I think.
And at MinCasa, we're a statewide organization, so we've been in a lot of discussions too with statewide law enforcement groups, so including the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the Minnesota Police Chiefs Association, and the Minnesota Sheriff's Association. So there is dialogue happening. And I work with multidisciplinary teams across the state, and it's been a really different reaction in different communities. So some communities, law enforcement are stepping up to the plate and saying, hey, we can do better than this. In some communities, we're seeing a lot of defensiveness. And the only thing that I would add to what Kristen said is another thing that I'm kind of like a broken record with is, I want you to think about this. Sexual violence is the only crime that we say it's he said, she said. We don't say that about homicide. We don't say that about burglary. We don't say that about arson. It is the only crime that we talk about like that. And I think that's what can be devastating to victim survivors, is that not only did this happen to me, but people aren't believing me, and law enforcement isn't believing me. So I think with our own lens, I think that's why we as a culture blame victims, because if you're sexually assaulted, I can go through your story and I can say, well, I would never go to that bar. I would never go home with somebody who I had just met. I wouldn't be in that neighborhood, right? I think that's because then that preserves my sense of safety. And I'm supposed to be an expert on sexual violence, and I am just as much at risk as anybody else. Those statistics apply to me as well.
Questions?
So yeah, we really wanted to come here tonight and ask you what your questions are and what's on your mind. Yeah.
Would it make a difference if there were more women in criminal justice, more women working with the police departments, or perhaps, I think the prosecutor's office probably has a pretty good number of women in Hennepin County, but would victims receive a different amount of support or interest, or would it make a difference?
Yeah. I can respond to that. I can let Kristen follow up. First of all, I want to remind people, folks of all genders are sexually assaulted, including male survivors, including gender nonconforming and trans, from those communities. So I have seen really awesome law enforcement. Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I work with some unbelievably talented and compassionate law enforcement. I do. I also work with some very difficult law enforcement. But I have seen female officers that were absolutely horrible, and I've seen really, really good male officers as well.
My short answer would be no. And I'm kicking myself here because I want there to be more women in law enforcement for other reasons. It's rough though. I don't know how else to say it, but it's a phenomenon that I've experienced. Women can be really tough on other women. It's definitely true of female jurors, and it's often true of female law enforcement. And it can be rough because with the few women, unfortunately, there just aren't a lot of female identified people in law enforcement at all. And what ends up happening is their colleagues all think they should take the criminal sexual conduct report. Oh, you'll want that one. And so they kind of, that can be annoying, right? Like, actually I don't, it could be any of us who takes it. And so they tend to be overrepresented in the officers that we work with. And many of them are good and some of them aren't good. But the reality is, we need a culture shift in law enforcement towards being more trauma informed, and we need more training for, if our patrol officers are going to be the ones taking these reports, to be honest, they need to be trained in what does trauma do to people's brains, and how are victims actually going to act when I'm interacting with them. because sort of misinformation and myths around that actually is a far bigger barrier to people being able to effectively work with victims than whatever their own individual gender might be. And so, just to be honest, no.
What are some of the complications in investigating rape? Why aren't more of them moved ahead? What are the stoppers?
I mean, I have to say, and I say this without working in the sex crimes unit, that I just have to think the first complication is capacity. If you have way too many cases to investigate and not enough people, I mean, that's a huge struggle. Sexual violence is a tool of oppression in our society. So it's often perpetrated by people who have more power or are seeking to gain power over other people, right? So often we think about that in terms of gender, right? Maybe men have more power and women maybe have less. But it also can come in terms of I may be cisgender and someone else is trans, or commonly we see, someone is undocumented and their perpetrator knows that about them and is going to exploit that to get their sexual needs met in unhealthy ways. And so, yeah, I want to let you tell me. Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Are you saying that we're not looking at those?
No, yeah, sorry,
and,
yes.
And yeah, I think we talk a lot as a movement about the roots of sexual violence are in oppression. So that's why sexual assault advocates are very concerned about racism, classism, ableism, ageism, etc. Because all of those isms are really about power and control, right? And what is sexual violence about 99.9% of the time? Power and control. Mm-hmm. And so you can look at any marginalized community, any of them, and I guarantee you there's a history of sexual violence there. So sexual violence is used as a tool to perpetrate those isms.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
Sorry about that. And so because a lot of people we work with come from more marginalized communities, it can make them more challenging to work with, especially for law enforcement who tend to be white and male. So we see sexual violence disproportionately targeting people who don't have homes to live in. Maybe they don't have a consistent cell phone, so it's hard to reach them or it's hard to find them. About 30% of the people who we serve at the Sexual Violence Center disclose that they live with severe and persistent mental illness. That was why they were targeted. It's not that they got that afterwards, they were targeted for that reason. It can make them challenging to work with. We work in every correctional facility in Hennepin County. Sometimes those people are perpetrated upon. It can make them a little bit more challenging to find and to work with and to talk to. And all of this just takes more time, and our investigators don't have the luxury of time. And so, in addition to the capacity thing, I think there's that issue as well.
Okay, knowing as much as you two know about the system and the issues, what would you recommend might be some incremental changes to the system that might be affected to improve? Thanks.
I have a couple of things to say. So one is I would say I'm a trained sexual assault advocate in accordance with state statute. But people only need to call me or come to me because they don't have anyone else to talk to. And so the first thing I would say is building community, right? Believing people when they say that something like this has happened to them. It's often the reaction of the first person that someone tells that determines whether they ever talk about it again, whether they ever make a police report, how they heal. Everything. And often we hear stories on our crisis line of I wasn't sure who was safe and I kind of hinted around with, my grandma, and then I kind of got shut down. Well, if that person made you feel weird, why'd you go there with them? And then kind of shut down and that was the end of it, right? Ideally, we're not necessary. Ideally, people's friends and family circle people with love after they've gone through something like this and say, I'm so sorry this happened to you. What can we do to help you move forward? And so I think the first thing I would say is just most people aren't reporting this. We talked about that, but they're also not talking about it. So just knowing that if anybody ever shares with you that they have gone through some form of sexual violence, they're giving you a gift. They're giving you a precious gift. There's something that you did right that made them feel like you're a safe person for them to come to. Please treat that gift with care, is the first thing that I would say. There are also a series of legislative actions I would recommend, which maybe Jude would like to talk about.
I think systemically, one of the things that I've had a really hard time with over the years is when law enforcement tells me we're not going to investigate this further or we've ended the investigation because we can't prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. We can't prove this to a jury. That is not actually the role of law enforcement, that's the role of the prosecutor. Prosecutors need to make that call. Okay, so that's one of the things that I've been happy about in the articles is that we've had law enforcement openly talking about that. Sometimes we talk about staying in our lanes, and I feel like that's a push. So one of the pieces of legislation, for example, that we just passed this last legislative session around sexual assault kids was we said that if law enforcement is choosing not to send in a kit to the BCA, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, that's our state crime lab, that they have to consult with prosecution. And there has to be that conversation and they have to do it within 60 days. So I think that's something that we need to have some more conversations about is what is law enforcement's role and what is prosecution's role. The other thing that Kristen mentioned before, and there's many different names for it, but the trauma-informed victim interviewing. So when we experience a trauma, our brains work in very different ways. So sitting down with the victim survivor, and I can't tell you how many times this happened to me. Okay, so I would respond to the hospital, right? And a sane nurse or a sexual assault nurse examiner would say, tell me what happened. And I would be in the room and I would hear the victim go through their story, right? And then maybe 3 or 4 hours later, a patrol officer would arrive and say, tell me what happened. And the victim survivor's story would change. That didn't mean that that victim survivor was making something up or wasn't being truthful. It's the way our brains absorb trauma. So we know that ideally, like making that first report is important because sexual violence is a public safety issue, right? Especially stranger rape is rare, but it does happen. So that's something law enforcement needs. Anything you can tell us, right? Like what did this person look like, that kind of thing. But the way that our brains absorb trauma, the way that we're interviewing victims, we're not doing it the right way. So for example, I'm working on a trauma-informed victim interviewing project with a retired detective from Utah. He left law enforcement because he didn't think he could change law enforcement and still be in law enforcement. And he trains officers. You don't ask what happened and give me a chronological time. You want to ask questions like, what did you smell? What did you hear? What did you taste? All of those kinds of questions. We can get much more information from victim survivors. And going back to the resource thing, here's what I'm hearing from law enforcement that are incorporating this trauma-informed victim interviewing. Guess what? Their cases are taking longer. It's taken 3 times as long because they have to make that investment into victim survivors. This is a gross generalization, what I'm about to say. Law enforcement kind of has a history of not taking care of themselves, right? So advocates, we talk a lot about self-care, right? I get that lecture from whoever's supervising me about once every 6 months. Jude, what are you doing to take care of yourself? right? And don't tell me you're taking bubble baths. I mean, like, take the day off, right? Yeah, don't. Bubble baths and Enya doesn't always do it for you. Law enforcement, I mean, we're seeing cops dropping dead of heart attacks at age 55, right? We're seeing rates of alcoholism that are like off the roof. We're seeing a lot of problems there. So all of a sudden, you're doing trauma-informed victim interviewing, and I'm hearing this from a lot of law enforcement across the country. They're forming trauma bonds with victim survivors. So as advocates, you know, even now, so I don't really directly work with victims anymore, but we get upset. Anybody comes to my office and they're upset about something, I drop everything. And when I was the program director at the Sexual Violence Center, my door was always open. If my door was shut, that meant something big was happening, right? And I would drop everything if an advocate came to debrief with me, right? And I could do the same with my colleagues. I don't know if that's so true in law enforcement culture. So I think law enforcement needs support too. And what I'm hearing, and I've been doing quite a bit of national travel in the last few months. What I'm hearing from law enforcement across the country, this is not a good time to be a cop. It's really not, right? And I think it's really hard to recruit new law enforcement. I think law enforcement has a lot of things that they need to be looking at. And going back to why don't people report, when the Sexual Violence Center used to be in North Minneapolis, the 4th precinct would ask me, why aren't young African American women reporting? And I was like, because 1 in 25 African American males at some point have been incarcerated, whether they're in Hennepin County Jail or they go to prison. You're dealing with a community that does not have a good relationship with law enforcement. You know, or when Kristen was talking about undocumented folks, right? I mean, I don't care what your political background is or what your beliefs are on immigration. If you're undocumented in this country right now, wouldn't you be a little nervous about talking to law enforcement? So those are some of the systemic changes that I think we need to make. And I think we need to, you know, we always talk about educating the jury pool, which is why even when I'm off the clock and the last thing I want to talk about is rape at the barbecue, I will do it, right? Because I'm hoping that this person's going to sit on a jury. By the way, so in 25 years, guess how many guilty convictions I've seen? 2.
Oh.
And 1 was in Duluth. I saw cases being charged out in Duluth that never would have been charged out in Hennepin County. I remember telling a prosecutor, I was like, you are crazy. I mean, I think it's great that you're charging this out, but this is going to be a tough one. So I think that there are some communities that are really raising that bar. But yeah, I think Hennepin County in particular has some really hard things to look at. And a humility. I think we all need a little bit of humility.
Thank you. Sorry.
The issue of police officers being taking care of themselves, quote unquote. I'm aware to some extent, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but they do get a certain number of new recruits coming out of the services. Right. So, my ex-husband was a guard at Stillwater. He was only there for 4 years, but almost every single person that he talked to at Stillwater had PSTD, and so did he. So think of a guy coming out of the service, especially Afghanistan or any of those, having had some connection with violence. And they go right into the police department. And that first issue of PSTD was never taken care of. And they go into the police department and it's not gonna be taken care of there either. So you have a certain level of problem that hasn't been acknowledged, much less somebody trying to do something about it.
Yeah. And one of my heroes in law enforcement is Chief Paul Schnell, who I met when I was a greener than green advocate. He was a sheriff's deputy with the Carver County Sheriff's Department. He went on to become the police chief of Hastings. From there, he went to Maplewood and he was their police chief. And then he retired, which I was like, we'll see how long that lasts. And now he's the chief of Inver Grove Heights. And some of you might have read his counterpoint that he wrote in the Star Tribune from a law enforcement perspective. But Chief Schnell, in addition to being an amazing man, he also has his master's degree in social work, and he also has his master's degree in like criminal justice or something. So he's got that social worker thing going for him too. But in his departments, he really institutes things like looking at domestic violence, looking at trauma that law enforcement are experiencing. And I think a lot of police chiefs could learn a lot from Paul Schnell. And he has been a wonderful ally and advocate on this issue to us.
Many people have asked us after these articles came out about like individual officers who were either named in the articles or individual bad cops. And for us, the issue is like the institution, right? There's a disconnect. There's all this crime happening to people who don't deserve it and deserve some justice. And then there's this process that they're supposed to be able to go through to get that justice. And they're like really far apart. And that's what we're trying to figure out, rather than focusing on, there's always going to be human error and human fallibility. There's always going to be individual bad apples, right? But there's also individual great apples who we work with every day, and yet the system is still failing victims and survivors. I think when we take a step back, big picture, everyone thinks sexual assault is bad. Nobody thinks anyone deserves it. But then we kind of get closer and closer and get into like the weeds, as we call it, right? And start thinking about like, well, who's it happening to and when and who's doing it to them, right? You know, I mean, we're advocates, which is like, you know, it's a counselor. And I really think of myself as a story collector. Like, people tell me their stories, and I've heard enough stories over the years, I've been able to develop an analysis of what is this beast called sexual violence? Like, who's it happening to, and who's doing it, and what are the circumstances under which it's happening, and what happens to them afterwards, right? And the common theme is that victims thought it was going to be very different afterwards than it is. They thought there was going to be a lot more support or different support than there actually was. And so when people ask me, like, well, what can we do to fix it? It's like, help us with this gap, right? I mean, if we're saying, if what our training is, that the hallmark of a successful case is sort of clear and credible testimony from a victim, one, and that's often not present, either because this person's deeply traumatized, maybe the story is changing and it's making people think that means they're not credible. Another scenario, which is actually fairly common, is there was alcohol or drugs that facilitated that sexual assault. So in Hennepin County, over the course of 1 year, 60% of the people who went to the hospital after sexual assault were drunk at the time that they were assaulted, right? So what's that going to do to your memory and your understanding of events? Or, you know, you just kind of like woke up somewhere and don't know how you got there. You know, you don't remember anything after 8 p.m. last night. So you don't really have a good testimony of what happened. You just have a lot of questions that you shouldn't have. So there's that. They want evidence as another hallmark of what would be a good case that would be taken forward, right? Well, we don't often have evidence. Most, of the people who go to the hospital and they have an examination by a specially trained nurse and they have evidence collected for the rape kit, which Jude works on, quite frankly, generally speaking, the rape kit results show some kind of sexual contact. But they don't really show that whether there was consent or no consent. Rape kits are better if it's a stranger rape case and you're trying to determine the identity of the assailant, right? But when you have someone, and again, 85% of victims know their perpetrator, so if you already have some pre-existing relationship, all that perpetrator has to say is, oh, they consented to it, they wanted to have the sex, right? Then it becomes the proverbial he said, she said. I go to the hospital alongside our advocates, and I'm telling you, like, very, very rarely are there cases like you think there might be of severe physical trauma. It does happen sometimes, and that is awful. But especially, just to be honest, like the vagina is made for childbirth, right? It can take a beating as an organ. And so there often isn't discernible trauma if it was a vaginal rape. And so the evidence may or may not be there. People pin a lot of hopes on the rape kit, and it often just shows sexual contact, which can be part of building the case, but is far from the smoking gun. And then the third thing that we're told is a hallmark of a successful case would be witnesses. Rapists generally don't do it before an audience. I mean, I'll tell you, and this sounds dark, we're real excited when they videotape it. Even though that sounds awful, we're like, God, you're so stupid, it's great. Those cases don't always go forward either, which is shocking. But, people might have seen, someone leading, I don't know, let's think of a stereotypical situation, like at a frat party, right? Someone leading, like a drunk college student away. They might have seen that, but they didn't actually see what happened after. And so if we're saying you need clear and credible testimony of a victim, you need evidence, and you need witnesses for a viable case, unfortunately, in criminal sexual conduct cases, a lot of those things are off the table. And so I guess what I'm here to say is, okay, well then what? And I hope it's a question you're asking your legislators, your city council members, please, who have control over money and how it's spent at the MPD, and whether they have more investigators for their sex crimes unit. There's this gap, and this gap is unacceptable. There are too many people being raped with impunity in our community, and something has to change. And we might not have all the answers about what, but we can definitely, we bear witness to the trauma and the pain and the suffering and how much that is compounded on people when there is no justice for them.
Are the officers who get the reports, are they trained very well? In your opinion, and would that be one of the suggestions that can be made, that they should have more training?
Yeah, we've been attending, my organization, not me personally, but we have been attending the post board, which is the training that law enforcement gets with their meetings. My boss just told me today she inserted herself on a committee. I was like, nice word. So yes, we do want more patrol officers to have that basic information. It depends on the law enforcement agency, but I've seen this in a lot of different places. If you want to advance your career in law enforcement, what law enforcement agencies do is they move you through all of the different, you might be in homicide for a few years, you might be in child abuse and neglect for a few years, and then they might put you in sex crimes. Sex crimes, again, off and on throughout the years. I know this was particularly true like 20 and 30 years ago, being appointed to sex crimes was a punishment. Maybe you were a little bit too loud with your union, maybe you were, or something like that, they would move you into sex crimes. I don't know if that's necessarily happening. I know some law.
It's changed a little.
Yeah, there's some law enforcement that would probably disagree with me. But the problem is that I've seen some really well-intentioned people, and not just in Minneapolis and in several places, that were positioned in sex crimes and they wanted to do a good job, but how, if you're only in there for 2 or 3 years. And so those folks aren't, basically the training you're getting is the training that you get in the academy, and then they have to have continuing education, which is why whenever we do law enforcement training at MinCasa, we always apply for those post credits so they can get those. And by the way, I'm really excited about this. On November 27th and November 28th, we're bringing in Justin Boardman, this law enforcement former detective from Utah, and he's going to be doing a 2-day training for law enforcement on trauma-informed victim interviewing. On the 27th, that will be open to the entire state, so law enforcement from all over the state can come. And then on the 28th, it's only for Ramsey County, because we're piloting a couple things in Ramsey County, and also St. Paul's been called out, Ramsey County's been called out. So we wanted to give those law enforcement the space that they need. We're also not letting any other discipline in the room. So these are cops that can really, they probably wouldn't agree with me when I say this, but so they can be vulnerable, right? And so they can be really, really honest. Did you want to add? Mm-hmm. Is there another question?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'm curious about the incidence of sexual violence, and it's increasing. I understand that most cases aren't reported, but in our environment these days, political environment, gun environment, immigration environment, the things that are going on, you guys are in the field, are you seeing an increase in the actual incidence of cases that are reported? Because you talk about power over others as being the major cause, and I would think that the violence that we're seeing growing in all parts of society is probably causing an increase in big numbers of sexual violence.
Actually, so I was born in Minnesota, and then I became a New Yorker, and then I came back. And when I came back in 1993, I don't know if any of you remember this, but Minneapolis was the rape capital of the country. Do you remember that? And people were like, oh my gosh, like this is out of control. Were people being sexually assaulted more in Minneapolis than they were in Wichita, Kansas? No. What that said to me is that in 1993, victim survivors felt safe and supported to come forward. So I think sexual violence has been pretty much at a steady rate. When I see communities where sexual assault has gone up, I just had this conversation with a rural county sheriff. I said, you're doing a good job. I know it doesn't look like you're doing a good job because your numbers are going up, but that means you're doing something right. Your advocacy is doing something right. Your medical response is doing something right. Prosecution, you all are doing something right. Which is why at MinCasa we do so much multidisciplinary teamwork, because we want those disciplines to be working together, to writing good protocols, so victim survivors feel like they can access.
This answer is not going to be very satisfying, which is, to be honest, we couldn't possibly know. The statistics, I'm not someone who actually ever presents using statistics. Kathy knows we get in fights about this. Because I just think they're a fantasy. You've heard these like FBI statistics, like 1 in 3 women will be sexually assaulted, and it's like what, 1 in something men, 7 men. They don't know because that's what law enforcement would know. And we already established most people don't report. So public health folks try from like a public health lens to do research. So on a nationwide level, the CDC tries to do research, and in Minnesota, it's our Department of Health. Our Department of Health last scrounged together enough money to do a full statewide research back in 2007. So those stats are so stale. I mean, one of the little like clips that came out of it was like every year in Minnesota, you might have heard this, 61,000 Minnesotans suffer some form of sexual violence, and then it was that's enough people to fill the Metrodome, which doesn't even exist anymore. That shows you how old that research is, right? And I asked them, like, why can't you do more research? We need to know what our prevalence is. And they said, like, they basically had to stop all other programming to be able to do the heavy lifting that to be able to produce that document. But even if they had, at the statewide level, enough sort of capacity to be able to do more research, the trick is, if we know that marginalized people are more likely to be impacted, those people are going to be hard for researchers to find and talk to. You know, even if the researchers don't worry, this isn't official and it can be anonymous, right? If you've been burned and you're skittish about authority figures in general, maybe they're not speaking your language, just there can be some distrust there. And so maybe the questions, we know are at the Sexual Violence Center, transgender people are disproportionately targeted with sexual violence, right? Maybe the researcher wasn't using good language around gender and really made that person feel unsafe. There's a lot of great researchers, but we've also worked with some who aren't so awesome. They just have they have some stuff to learn, right? So we know reason that a lot of folks might not even feel comfortable even talking to researchers. And so our issue is so under-researched. We can talk about how many different kinds of people are impacted in so many different kinds of ways, and it leads us to believe that we really do live in a rape culture and the sexual violence is all around us. But for us to talk about prevalence, it would just be like we would just be guessing. It's really rough. You very well might be right, but we could never say.
That's okay. Do you think that the Me Too movement will have any impact on sexual violence?
Yes, I do. I do want to acknowledge, though, with the Me Too movement, going back to like privilege, guess who the majority of Me Too, a lot of them are white women, a lot of those are women that are at least middle class, or, so I'm concerned about the voices that we're not hearing. And also the whole Me Too movement was kind of co-opted from actually a woman of color who was doing Me Too stuff years before. But yeah, I think people are talking about it. I've been talking a lot about legislatively, even before I knew about Me Too, any of us knew about that, before these Strib articles. I was really banking on 2019 being my year at the legislature, because last year the bill that we got passed was gutted so much because we had to compromise and compromise and compromise. I'm not bitter at all. So what I've been telling my allies and my colleagues is that this is our moment in the sun. Legislatively, because I do a lot of policy work. Last year, our bill passed unanimously on the House floor and the Senate floor. And I think that's because there wasn't a single legislator that wanted to come out and say anything negative about sexual assault. And I want to capitalize on that because I've got some stuff that I've got to get done, right? I think it is having an impact. You want to add anything?
Sure. I am so grateful every time, even though it's a lot to both work at this and then I get home and my People magazine is all stories about celebrities perpetrating sexual violence. I'm so grateful that people are talking about it. These stories that you're reading about are the stories that we've been hearing for years. What worries me is sort of what comes next. There's been a lot of, it just feels almost like mob justice, like someone gets outed as a perpetrator and then it's this person should be destroyed. And that doesn't feel very good to me because, and I know this may be an uncomfortable truth, but many victim survivors we work with, they love their perpetrators. They just want the violence to end. They don't want this person destroyed. They just don't want to keep, they want the violence to end. And so it's a little black and white, the justice that's being meted out. It makes me just feel a little bit nervous. It's like this person's named, now they will be destroyed. This person's name, and I want there to be some accountability. And we know it doesn't come through the criminal justice process, but right now there is no alternate avenue. We're just at this first stop, and I think that reality will be silencing to a lot of people. Like it's only a certain group of folks who are comfortable having that happen, and so it makes me uncomfortable. Are you standing because we're done? But there was one more question.
One more question, and then.
I think was it you? Okay.
So looking at your, the graphic here about how so few incidences of sexual violence can actually be prosecuted because of various reasons like reporting and whether there's evidence and whether it's likely to get the outcome that they're seeking. It sounds like having more police resources would definitely be valuable, but it also sounds like that's not really the whole answer. And would something like tweaking some laws that would help people in marginalized communities to come out more without being afraid, or be helpful? Or even like if you think of like drunk driving, there's programs that people get assigned to by judges where they have to go through a program and not necessarily be in jail. Could things like that be a way to sort of, capture more people that are perpetrating it without, resorting to jail time?
My steps. Okay. Thank you for that question. What I would say is that there's work to be done on our statutes. And I think legislators could take it a lot more seriously. There's been, after each article that's come out, there's been kind of like a crescendo of interest that's coming from legislators, and then it kind of dies down a little bit. But the way that alcohol-facilitated sexual assault is accounted for in our statute is horrible and needs to be addressed. The way that the statute deals with someone who is mentally incapacitated because they are drunk ties the hands of prosecutors behind their backs. And since that's the majority of what we see at SVC, that's something that I could say on a legislative side. Through another avenue entirely, though we want to improve the criminal justice response, at SVC we are actually working on partnerships with local restorative justice organizations. We would like to see a restorative justice model to help people move forward after a sexual assault. If they wanted it, I want to be really clear. This would have to be completely something that the victim survivor would want to see happen. It should never be imposed on them by any means. But there's an appetite for restorative justice for juvenile offenses as like diversion programs, especially in Hennepin County. And what I keep getting told, because I keep trying to bring this up in meetings, is criminal sexual conduct is too serious. We can't do restorative justice with those kind of crimes. And what I'm saying is that process would speak to victim survivors who we're working with, who again, maybe their family is financially dependent on their perpetrator, or maybe they're in a relationship with that person. They don't want that person going to jail. So even if we created a perfect process, criminal justice, but they still wouldn't want to participate in it. And so I think any goodwill towards any kind of projects around that. There's small nonprofits in Minneapolis doing restorative justice work, but they're real small. The one I've been talking to most is the Seward Longfellow Restorative Justice Project, if any of you have heard of that.
Yeah, I was going to say this earlier. You know, the other odd thing about sexual violence is that, okay, so over here, we don't really believe victims, and when we do believe them, we blame them, right? And then over here, the people who commit sexual violence are the monsters of the world, and we should line them up against a wall and shoot them down, right? I'm on the board of directors of MNSORP, which is the Minnesota Sex Offender Reentry Project, and the reason why I'm on that board is because I want sex offenders to have stable housing, and I want them to be able to have stable employment. We know that those are two key factors in recidivism and dropping that. The residency restrictions that we're seeing in Minnesota, folks, we're gonna end up like Florida in about 5 years. In Florida, it is so hard for sex offenders to re-enter communities. They're living under bridges. And when you're living under a bridge, you're not in contact with your probation officer. We don't know where these folks are. Plus, it's inhumane. It really is inhumane the way that we treat sex offenders. I have a lot of problems, well, obviously with residency restrictions, but I have a lot of problems with community notification. I get a lot of those phone calls, even at the coalition, where people are like, I just found out so-and-so is a sex offender, and I want to know why I don't have access to that information. And like, probably because they're not a level 3 sex offender. When I was living in Duluth, arson was a problem. Why don't we have community notification for arsonists? I would really like to know where arsonists are in my community, right? Wouldn't you like to know that? But it's none of my business. So I think, and I also hear people say things like sex offender treatment doesn't work. Give me the research on that. Because I work very closely with corrections, with probation, and with sex offender treatment programs. And I think people can be rehabilitated. And P.S., the youngest sex offender in the state of Minnesota to go on the registry, do you know how old that individual was? 8. I'm not willing to slap sex offender on an 8-year-old. So anyway, so yes, I do think that we need to look more at that. And I agree with Kristen. I have very complex feelings about prison. I also used to do a lot of work around PREA, which is Prison Rape Elimination Act. Guess who the vast majority of my clients were? Sex offenders. And I mean, people drop the soap jokes about sex offenders. People yell things like, I hope you get what's coming to you. And I just really want to challenge people, if you really believe that no one deserves to be sexually assaulted, which I believe, that includes inmates, that includes sex offenders. So yeah, I don't know. And again, I just want to say, to echo what Kristen said, I'm going to be really honest with you right now. If I were sexually assaulted tomorrow, I probably would not report to law enforcement. But I always do what my clients want. So if my clients want to pursue the criminal justice system, fine. This isn't about me, this is about them. But I would really like, and that's something that we've been having conversations about at the coalition, let's look at alternative healing. So I know one The Revolution That Begins at Home. Have any of you heard of that book? That's a book that came out of activist communities, particularly queer and trans activist communities, saying we don't want to participate in the criminal justice system because we don't want to participate with the prison industrial complex. So how do we support survivors and have offender accountability in our communities? And those are things that I really like to explore, because I don't think the criminal justice system is necessarily always the answer. You're shutting us down, right?
I am.
She's standing.
She's standing.
Thank you so much. I do have one thing to ask you yet. We are people here who do take action. You have been talking about a few things sort of legislatively and but could you just give us like 2 things that you would that be something that we could do? Or one thing even. What is it that we should really look at that we could actually help make a difference? Is there anything, or is it all so nebulous that we can't? Okay, so
I can talk about the state and federal level. I forgot to address this, but somebody was asking, we pass legislation for like marginalized communities. I don't know if you've been paying attention to this, but the Trump administration is working really hard on taking away U visas. Do you know what U visas are? Those were special visas that are given to people who have experienced domestic or sexual violence in the United States. And it's like a safety net, so they can go forward, they can report, they can do things like that. We are this close to losing U visas, and I don't think anyone's paying attention to that. So I would, in addition to talking to your state legislators, make sure that you're holding Amy Klobuchar accountable, okay? Because that's really critical and really important. On a statewide level, how many of you guys, I personally follow local politics the way most people follow football, right? So like the legislative session, that's why I was so excited to come back to the legislature, because I used to do policy work, but left in 2004. So this is like my Super Bowl, right? My football season when I'm over there. Watch us, go to our website, we're mincasa.org. We're pretty good about keeping, right now we're switching our website over this week, but I'm gonna be really honest with you, I'm still duking out that was a violent thing for me to say, duking out. I'm duking out the details about our policy agenda. I know I'm holding a statewide meeting for my program where I'm bringing all the key stakeholders together. I wanna know what everybody's legislative agenda is, including the BCA, including the chiefs, the Minnesota Sheriff's Association. I want to know where the Attorney General's office is, those kinds of things. So our legislative agenda is probably going to be a little bit late this year. I'm going to be honest with you. Somebody quoted my executive director as saying, Jude is anxious about our policy agenda. I was like, anxious, I'm climbing the wall. So we're still putting those things together. But yeah, this is a great group, and I can get your contact information, and I can make sure that you're getting our email blasts, so you can contact your legislators. But on a local level, what can we do with county commissioners and city councilors?
There is so much to be done. Please call our mayor, Jacob Fry. Let him know you're around and you're watching him. He wants Minneapolis to be like just this amazing, wonderful city, and I think that's great. But let's extend that to the treatment that we give to survivors of criminal sexual conduct. Again, let's not just say the nationwide average is good enough for us, right? Like, let's actually put our minds to this puzzle. Let's make Minneapolis the model for what's just not happening nationwide with regards to victims and survivors support. It's the mayor who's in charge of the police department. Of course, it's the chief. But right now, they're talking about maybe changing that to the city council. But contacting your council members as well as the mayor and saying, like, it's just not okay. It's just not okay that so many people are slipping through the cracks. And what are they going to do about it? What are they going to do that's a new idea? What are they going to do that's innovative? Who are they talking to? Are they talking to us? I'd really like to talk to them. And on the county level, your county commissioners as well are people that are very important to reach out to. And just to be honest, help us at the Sexual Violence Center reach more people who need us. We were started in the very early days of 1985 in a house about 10 blocks away from here. And most people still don't know about us until they need us. And that really compounds the crisis and the trauma for folks as they're like flailing, trying to figure out who to call. Everyone knows if your house is on fire, you call 911. And yet, statistically speaking, people are so much more likely to have sexual violence come into their lives than have their house burned down. We have a marketing problem. We really need your help. Our services are free. We know people need us. We've done sort of a comparison of prevalence data to our census, and basically for every one person who walks through our door, we know there's 10 in our 3 counties who aren't coming to us. And we believe a lot of them is because they don't know that we exist. So I have a big stack of our brochures back there, and we also have a stack of flyers for just one of our support groups. It's a standing support group every Monday night at 6 o'clock for anybody who just needs support. They can come in once and never come back, or they could come every week. So if you could please help us get the word out to people who are suffering in our community, it would do a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, that was very helpful. Thank you both for taking the time. I know that you've been really busy, so it's been great. We are a volunteer organization, so as you leave, if you want to drop a little bit in our little bucket there to help to defray the expenses for this, that would be fabulous. Next month, we do this the first Tuesday of every month. Next month, we are talking with Hennepin County. Funny you should mention them. They have a giant budget, and we think we ought to take a look at how they use it and how transparent it is and what's going on there. So next month, it's Hennepin County. With that, are there any announcements?
Sorry, it's another question. Are these organizations nonprofits or you support?
501c3, yep.
You ought to have a list over here so we can,
A list of what?
well, get on their email list and.
Oh, good point. Well, on our website, we have a thing where you can sign up for our mailing list.
Yeah.
So if you take one of our brochures, the website's on there. It's a very good point.
Okay, with that, thank you.
Research is showing us that there's between 20 and 40 bystanders before a sexual assault occurs. So teaching people, this is what you can do if you're like at the fraternity party and you see somebody dragging a drunk person out, or this is what you can do when you are worried about a child being. This past year, we passed some legislation that was mostly around sexual assault kits, and really victim notification. We have time limits on when law enforcement has to pick them up, when they send them in. This year, I would really like to focus on many different things, but like I said, we just haven't really solidified our policy agenda.
Do you have any idea how many victims there are statewide?
I have no idea. Kind of like what Kristen was saying, we don't have really strong numbers. The last number that we saw was from that report that the Minnesota Department of Health did that said that 61,000 Minnesotans are sexually assaulted annually.